The North Atlantic, immense and icy, had something hidden among the waves. It wasn't just any ship. It was a mass of steel moving with a fixed course and with an objective that no one fully knew. For the British, it was not difficult to notice it. The reports came one after another. An enormous ship had gone out to sea and did not seem to want to go unnoticed. In a matter of hours, ships, planes and radars began to move everywhere. Tension was in the air. Everyone knew that if that thing reached its destination, it could completely change the course of the war. Meanwhile, inside the vessel, every step, every maneuver was made with the pressure of knowing that everything could explode at any moment. It was a race against time, against the enemy and against the sea itself. No one was sure how it would all end, but everyone knew the same thing. It had to be stopped. Who would manage to do it first? The order that unleashed hell in the Atlantic. On the 23rd of May 1941, at dawn, Admiral Gunther Lutyens was in the map room of the flagship Bismarck. In front of him was a large table with nautical charts showing the western coast of Norway and the North Atlantic. Beside the table, several officers awaited his instructions as he observed the weather situation and the latest intelligence reports. The order he held in his hands came directly from the Supreme Naval Command, signed by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. It was the final authorization to carry out Operation Rheinübung, a raiding mission in the Atlantic against British supply routes. The Bismarck, escorted by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, was to go out to sea undetected and attack enemy merchant traffic. The decision was not taken lightly. From the first months of the war, the British naval blockade had exerted constant pressure on Germany. Despite the efforts of submarines and the occasional assaults by auxiliary cruisers, the United Kingdom continued to receive large quantities of supplies from the United States and other colonies. The only way to interrupt this vital flow was to send large surface units to sow chaos on those routes. However, these operations were extremely risky. The Graf Spee had been sunk in the Rio de la Plata, the Blucher, during the invasion of Norway, and the Gneisenau and the Scharnhorst had been damaged in previous engagements. Even so, the High Command believed that the new flagship battleship, the Bismarck, could change the balance. The Bismarck was the pride of the Kriegsmarine. With more than 50,000 tons of displacement and armed with 8 380mm cannons, it represented a formidable threat to any enemy unit. Its armor, speed and range gave it an unprecedented combination of resistance and mobility. The British knew it. Since its launching, the Bismarck was observed with fear and respect by the British Admiralty, which considered it a direct danger to naval supremacy in the Atlantic. For that reason, every movement of the ship was closely followed. Germany kept it away from direct combat, waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived in May. The choice of date was influenced by several factors. In the first place, British warships were scattered in various areas of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. In second place, German naval intelligence had detected less escort activity in the North Atlantic, which made an incursion viable. In addition, the Prinz Eugen, which would accompany the Bismarck, was already prepared after having performed exercises and repairs. All that was needed was a favorable weather window to begin the operation. That window opened in late May. Lutyens, a career officer with experience and reputation, knew that the mission would be extremely dangerous. Despite the power of the Bismarck, the Royal Navy had numerical superiority and nearby bases from which it could deploy its units quickly. For that reason, success depended on remaining undetected for as long as possible. The plan contemplated sailing toward the north through the Baltic Sea, going around the coast of Norway, and then crossing the Denmark Strait to reach the open Atlantic. From there, the two ships would separate and attack different convoy routes, without engaging enemy squadrons unless it was unavoidable. Admiral Raeder had insisted that the mission was not a direct confrontation, but an operation of economic attrition. The objective was to force the enemy to reinforce the escort of its convoys, which would divert resources from other areas. In addition, the sinking of freighters and oil tankers would affect the British economy and highlight the fragility of their logistical system. Although Lutyens had reservations about the viability of the plan, he accepted the order. His role was to execute it with military precision. Before departing, a meeting was held with the commanders of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen. Captain Ernst Lindemann, in command of the Bismarck, was an experienced sailor respected by his crew. He had confidence in the ship and its capabilities, but also understood the magnitude of what was coming. During the meeting, the planned routes, refueling points, radio codes, and rules of engagement were reviewed. It was established that fire would only be opened if the enemy detected the ships, and there was no possibility of avoiding them. Otherwise, the most important thing was to maintain secrecy. The operation required absolute coordination. German submarines had been deployed in key areas to detect British movements and alert about convoys. Long-range reconnaissance planes would also be used to identify routes free of enemies. Everything had to work like clockwork. However, the weather was an unpredictable factor. The waters of the Denmark Strait were treacherous, with fog, ice, and unpredictable winds. For this reason, the departure was kept secret even from part of the crew until the last moment. Only a few knew the exact destination and route. In the hours before the departure, the atmosphere on board was tense but disciplined. The Bismarck's crew had been thoroughly trained, and the ship was fully supplied. The holds carried thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. Every corner had been inspected. The engines were in perfect condition. The communication systems had been checked, and the turrets had been calibrated for combat. Nothing was left to chance. The orders were clear: leave Gotenhafen and reach the operating area undetected. As evening fell, the Bismarck slowly hoisted its anchor. The propellers began to turn, and the ship, imposing and silent, moved away from the dock. By its side, the Prinz Eugen did the same. It was the beginning of Operation Rheinübung. The lights of the coast disappeared little by little as the two steel giants advanced into the darkness. No one knew for sure what awaited them, but everyone knew that it would not be an easy journey. It was a mission that could change the course of the war or become a disaster. The decision was already made. That night, the Bismarck sailed north through the Baltic. The radio remained in absolute silence. Only coded messages by optical signals between the ships were allowed. The fog helped to conceal their presence. On board, the sailors continued with their routines, but everyone knew they were entering dangerous territory. In the engine rooms, the engineers monitored the pressure of the boilers. At the observation posts, the lookouts watched the horizon without rest. And on the bridge, Lutyens observed the charts with the concentration of someone who knows that any error could be fatal. The Bismarck had been built to resist. Its side armor had a layer of steel more than 300 millimeters thick, and its compartments were divided with watertight doors that could be closed in seconds. Its main armament was capable of firing 800-kilogram projectiles at more than 30 kilometers away. In addition, it had a complement of more than 2,100 men, trained to operate in extreme conditions. However, naval history had shown that no ship is invulnerable. Its officers knew it, the British knew it, and Lutyens knew it. With dawn, the ships continued their course without incident. The next step would be to go around Norway and reach the Denmark Strait. If they managed to cross it undetected, they would have the open Atlantic to operate freely. But if they were discovered, the Royal Navy would deploy all its force to intercept them. It was a risky gamble, a decision made at a key moment in the war, and there was no turning back. The ghost departure of Hitler's most feared monster. During the early morning of May 19, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were preparing to leave the port of Gotenhafen, located on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. The sky was overcast and a fine drizzle fell on the deck of both ships. The port lights were off and the atmosphere was silent. Only the constant murmur of the machines and the whispered orders from the officers could be heard. The crew, who had already boarded days before, waited tensely for the start of the operation. Everything was ready for departure. The Bismarck started its main engines shortly before 2 in the morning. The enormous propellers began to turn slowly, while the ship began to move smoothly. On board, the sailors took their posts without exchanging many words. They knew it was an important mission, but the exact details were not known to everyone. The Prinz Eugen, which would accompany it on the journey, maneuvered a short distance away, synchronizing its movements with those of the battleship. Both ships were escorted by minesweepers during the first part of the journey, as the Baltic was still an area with floating mines placed by the British and the Kriegsmarine itself. The commander of the Bismarck, Ernst Lindemann, and Admiral Günther Lutyens, in charge of the operation, remained on the command bridge, reviewing each phase of the plan. Although the ship had a crew of more than 2,000 men, the key decisions were made by a small group of officers in the command room. The departure was scheduled to be as discreet as possible. The intention was to avoid any sighting by enemy observers or even by neutral ships that could inform the British about the activity in the port. The darkness and bad weather helped to conceal the movement. Upon leaving Gotenhafen, the ships headed north, skirting the Swedish coast. This initial stretch was within German-controlled waters and was considered safe. However, there was concern about the possibility of spy planes flying over the area. To reduce that risk, a less direct route was chosen, closer to the coast and with aerial surveillance support from the Luftwaffe. During the first hours of the journey, the atmosphere on board was one of contained tension. The crew carried out their tasks efficiently, without distractions. The radio silence order was maintained to prevent any signal interception. The navigation through the Baltic Sea was carried out without incident. After crossing in front of the coast of Sweden, the group entered the Kattegat Strait. At this point, the waters narrow, and there is more maritime traffic, including Scandinavian fishing boats and freighters. Vigilance was redoubled, as there was a risk of being detected by civilian vessels that, even if they were not enemies, could report their observations. The gunners were ordered to remain ready, but not to fire unless it was absolutely necessary. The priority was to keep the mission covert. On May 21st, the group arrived at the Grimstad Fjord area, south of Bergen in Norway. There they made a technical stop that was part of the plan. The purpose was to supply the Prinz Eugen with additional fuel and allow a final technical review. The Bismarck, with a greater carrying capacity, did not need to refuel at that time. During this stop, the crew had a few hours of rest, but without letting their guard down. Shifts were distributed for rest, and inspections of the ship's main systems were carried out. The weather remained cloudy, which favored the discretion of the operation. On land, German agents reported that no suspicious activity had been detected near the fjord. However, the next day, a British Lockheed Hudson reconnaissance plane flew over the area and photographed the ships. Although the flyover was brief, the images obtained later would alert British intelligence that the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were active and ready to head to the Atlantic. However, at that moment, the operation was still moving forward without alterations. On May 22nd, the ships left Grimstad Fjord at dusk. This second departure was made with even more precautions. The darkness was total and no lights were allowed on deck. The navigation was done at low speed at the beginning while leaving the narrow fjord. The lookouts were in their posts with binoculars and night vision goggles. Any floating object, any reflection of light, could mean danger. The atmosphere was one of absolute concentration. Once on the open sea, the ships resumed cruising speed. The objective was to reach the North Atlantic without being detected by the British forces, especially the destroyers and cruisers that patrolled the area. The next stage was the most critical, crossing the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. This passage was one of the few accesses to the Atlantic Ocean from the North Sea, and it was constantly monitored by the Royal Navy. The Germans knew that the British used to keep ships in that area, and that coastal patrol planes flew over the region. Lutyens, aware of the risk, ordered a tight formation and maximum silence. Radars would not be used actively to avoid being located by signals. They would only be turned on in case of a direct threat. During the crossing of the strait, the weather worsened. Visibility was drastically reduced by the low fog and constant rain. Despite the difficulties, this represented a tactical advantage, as it made it difficult for the ships to be sighted from the air or from other ships. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen sailed in a parallel formation, separated by several hundred meters, but with internal communication using coded lights. The waves hit the hulls hard, but both ships maintained their course with precision. On board the Bismarck, security measures were reinforced. Strict shifts were established for rest, surveillance, and maintenance. The radar personnel constantly monitored the surroundings, although only with passive equipment. The artillery operators were on alert, but it was not allowed to open fire without a direct order. The crossing took several hours, during which the crew remained at their posts without rest. Each officer knew his function and stuck to the established plan. Coordination was key. During the night of May 23rd, the group managed to complete the passage through the strait without confirmed incidents. There had been no confirmed sightings by the enemy. The officers began to relax slightly, although without abandoning vigilance. From that point on, they were officially in the North Atlantic. They had managed to cross the most dangerous point without being intercepted. It was a significant operational achievement. The next step would be to carry out reconnaissance of British trade routes and begin attacks on the merchant fleet, according to the original instructions of the operation. Lutyens, however, knew that the risk had not disappeared. Despite the successful crossing, there was a possibility that British intelligence was tracking the movements. The order was given to maintain combat speed and slightly change course to mislead any possible pursuit. A greater separation was also established between the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen as a measure to reduce the probability that both would be sighted together. The coordination between the two ships would continue through visual signals and encrypted messages. The weather in the Atlantic remained unstable. Strong winds and intermittent rains complicated navigation. However, this also made British operations difficult. The Bismarck's crew remained busy with routine tasks, technical adjustments, and internal training. Although there were no concrete signs of danger, no one let their guard down. The lookouts continued in their posts, the radar operators checked every signal, and the officers held constant meetings to analyze the situation. The radar saw them first. That's how the pursuit began. On the morning of May 23rd, shortly before 8 o'clock, the British cruiser Suffolk was patrolling the Denmark Strait area. Its radar picked up signals in the distance. The officer on duty immediately gave notice to the bridge. Captain Ellis ordered a change of course toward the source of the signal and an increase in speed. The sky was overcast and there was a mist. Through the radar, they could see that two large vessels were approaching, but it was not clear what kind they were. At 8 o'clock sharp, the radar operator reported that the signals were stable and moving in the same direction as the Suffolk. This indicated that they were large ships moving at a constant speed. A few minutes later, the silhouette of one of the ships could be seen through the fog. It was enormous and had straight masts. There was no doubt it was the Bismarck. Beside it, more towards the bow, was the Prinz Eugen. Captain Ellis informed the Admiralty by radio and also the Norfolk, another British cruiser patrolling in the area. The Norfolk, under the command of Vice Admiral Wakewalker, was further south. It immediately changed its course to intercept the Germans. The British knew that if they let these ships escape, they would reach the Atlantic and could sink convoys undetected. The Suffolk kept its distance. Its radar allowed it to follow the Germans without risking being hit by their cannons. The Prinz Eugen was closer to the Suffolk than the Bismarck. Despite the difficult conditions, the radar worked well. Meanwhile, the Norfolk accelerated. At 9 in the morning, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen sighted it first. The Bismarck fired 2 times. The Norfolk responded by turning and launching a smokescreen to hide. There were no hits. The Norfolk withdrew, and from that moment on it maintained constant communication with the Suffolk, coordinating the surveillance. The British Admiralty, upon receiving the information about the Bismarck's position, reacted quickly. The Hood and the Prince of Wales, which were west of Iceland, received orders to advance to meet the Germans. Other ships were also ordered to be strategically located to cut off any escape routes. Admiral Tovey, in command of the Home Fleet, directed these maneuvers from the King George V. On board the Bismarck, the situation also changed. The crew found out that they had been detected. Admiral Lutyens decided not to alter the original plan. His idea was to continue southwest, enter the Atlantic, and attack convoys. He considered that the enemy cruisers were not an immediate threat. However, he ordered the Prinz Eugen to take a position in front of the Bismarck, as he believed they had been located by radar and wanted the cruiser to detect possible threats hidden in the fog. A change of place between the German ships occurred without the British realizing it. The British continued to report positions regularly. Every time the Suffolk or the Norfolk saw the Bismarck, they sent data. Although they could not get close because of the risk of being destroyed, their tracking work was key. British naval intelligence analyzed all these reports to anticipate the course the Germans might take. It was discussed whether the Germans would try to break to the west or if they would make a maneuver to the south. The Hood and the Prince of Wales were already in motion. Both were sailing at maximum speed. Their objective was to intercept the Bismarck as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the Suffolk and the Norfolk followed behind the German formation, being careful to stay out of the range of the cannons. At times, the Germans would disappear into the fog. Other times, they would briefly reappear. The British radar operators remained alert at all times. Visibility was low, but the technology made it possible to maintain contact. In the afternoon of May 23rd, Vice Admiral Wakewalker maintained communication with the Admiralty. He reported that he had detected a change of course in the Germans. Now they seemed to be heading more to the west. It was feared that they would try to escape north of the strait. The British Admiralty again adjusted the positions of its ships. The Repulse, another battlecruiser, was sent south of Greenland. The aircraft carrier Victorious was also ordered to head west. On board the Bismarck, Commander Lindemann received reports on the situation. He knew that the British were following him, but he did not believe they were capable of attacking directly under those conditions. Admiral Lutyens thought that if they continued at a constant speed and without confrontations, they would soon lose their pursuers. They did not know that the British were coordinating a network of units to surround them. During the night, the British cruisers continued with the surveillance. They used radar as their main tool. At one point, the Suffolk lost contact. An interference affected the radar. For more than 1 hour, they were unable to locate the Germans. It was feared that they had lost them definitively. However, when the radar worked again, the contacts reappeared. The Germans had not changed course. They continued to advance to the southwest, although at a lower speed. The Bismarck had reduced its speed so as not to use so much fuel. In the early morning of May 24th, the sky began to clear. The British cruisers had better visibility, although they still maintained a certain distance. They knew that the Hood and the Prince of Wales were already close. Everything indicated that a confrontation would occur soon. The reports sent during the night had served to precisely calculate the Bismarck's trajectory. The British fleet was in position. Captain Ellis of the Suffolk sent his last position report at 2:30 in the morning. After that, he maintained radio silence so as not to alert the Germans. The cruisers were preparing to leave the direct pursuit. They would soon be relieved by the larger combat ships. Their mission was almost accomplished. They had managed to maintain contact with the enemy for more than a day, guiding the fleet to a meeting point. The day the Bismarck made British pride explode. On the morning of May 24th, before dawn, the conditions in the Denmark Strait were dark, cold and humid. The sea was covered by a thick fog that made visibility difficult, although radar had allowed the ships to maintain contact with each other. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen were sailing together, heading south, unaware that a British squadron was rapidly approaching from the west. The Hood and the Prince of Wales were already in position to intercept them, and at 5:35, the lookouts on the Prinz Eugen detected dark silhouettes emerging from the horizon. The identification was immediate. They were 2 enemy warships advancing at full speed. The tension on board increased. Admiral Lutyens received the report and ordered the gunners to prepare. Captain Lindemann of the Bismarck was also informed and responded quickly. The German gunners began to adjust their cannons, while the British did the same from the other side. The distance between the 2 formations was rapidly shortening. The Hood, which was leading the line, was still considered one of the most powerful ships in the Royal Navy, but its armour was not uniform, and its structure was already showing signs of aging. At 5:52, the Hood fired the first salvo. The projectiles crossed the sky and fell into the sea without reaching their target. The Prince of Wales followed, opening fire with its main artillery. The Germans took a little longer to respond. Lutyens did not want to start combat if he could avoid it, but the enemy's proximity no longer left any options. Lindemann broke the silence by saying that he would not allow them to be shot at without responding. He asked for permission to return fire and, without waiting for a clear answer, authorized it on his own. At 5:55, the cannons of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen thundered for the first time. The exchange of fire was brutal. The explosions shook the sea and the columns of water rose every few seconds. The Hood maneuvered to close the distance, trying to use its artillery with greater precision, but its trajectory made it easy for enemy projectiles to hit its deck. One of the Prinz Eugen's shots hit the Hood in one of its midsections, generating a fire. The flames began to spread, and although the crew tried to contain them, the damage was already done. Meanwhile, the Bismarck focused its attention on the Hood, firing with its main cannons. At 6:01, one of those projectiles hit the central area of the Hood directly. The explosion was so violent that the ship practically split in two. In a matter of seconds, the structure disappeared underwater, leaving a cloud of smoke and fire. The Prince of Wales, which was right behind, was forced to maneuver sharply to avoid the wreckage. The emotional impact was immediate. Of the more than 1,400 men who were on board the Hood, only 3 managed to survive. The Prince of Wales, still in shock, continued the combat. Its shots were inaccurate, and its crew still did not have enough experience for a battle of that magnitude. It suffered several impacts from the Bismarck, including one that destroyed part of the command bridge. Despite the damage, it managed to stay afloat and withdrew, covered by a smoke screen. The Germans did not pursue it. Lutyens decided not to risk his ships and ordered them to stay on the original course. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the noise of the engagement had alerted the entire British fleet. In the following hours, the news of the sinking of the Hood spread throughout England. The impact was enormous. The Hood was a symbol of the Royal Navy, and its destruction was seen as an irreplaceable loss. The British High Command ordered a total mobilization. All available ships were to join the hunt for the Bismarck. From that moment on, the operation ceased to be an interception patrol and was transformed into a massive pursuit. The priority was to find and destroy the German ship at any cost. On board the Bismarck, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew had celebrated the victory, but the officers knew that they would now be relentlessly pursued. The ship had suffered damage. One of the Prince of Wales's projectiles had pierced a fuel tank, causing a considerable leak. Although the structural damage did not compromise the combat capacity, it did limit the range of the journey. There had also been vibrations in one of the propellers, although it was not known if it was serious damage or a simple imbalance. Lutyens was convinced that the priority was to continue towards the assigned operating area. He believed that they could evade the British forces by using speed and evasive maneuvers. However, the technical officers recommended considering a detour to make repairs. Captain Lindemann suggested looking for a port on the French coast where they could receive support. Communications with Berlin intensified, and possible escape routes were discussed. The situation was delicate. Although they had just achieved a significant victory, the risk of being trapped by an increasingly numerous enemy fleet was real. Meanwhile, at the British command, forces were redistributed throughout the Atlantic. Reconnaissance planes, cruisers, destroyers and battleships received new orders. Admiral Tovey reorganized his fleet and prioritized intercepting the Bismarck before it reached safe territory. The British Navy could not afford another defeat. The sinking of the Hood had put at stake not only naval prestige, but also the morale of the entire country. During the following hours, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen continued to sail. The sea was still covered by low clouds and limited visibility. Radar became essential to maintain course and detect any attempt at interception. Despite the risk, Admiral Lutyens decided to separate the ships. The Prinz Eugen was to continue to the west and carry on with the mission of attacking convoys. The Bismarck, for its part, was to try to reach the nearest port in France. It was a risky decision, but it would allow them to confuse the British and split their pursuit. Before separating, both ships performed a final review of systems and resources. The exchange of messages was brief, but formal. The Prinz Eugen's crew prepared to act on their own, while the Bismarck adjusted its course. The separation was carried out without incident, and from that moment on, the Bismarck was left alone on the high seas, with an entire fleet looking for it and an increasingly narrower margin of error. The largest hunt in modern naval history. The first few minutes after the exchange of fire in the strait were chaotic. On the bridge of the Prince of Wales, confusion reigned while the crew members tried to repair the damage caused by the impact of the enemy projectiles. The British ship had received several serious blows and, despite its firepower, was not in optimal condition to continue the confrontation. Its captain decided to change course, moving away from the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen, which continued to sail together. At that moment, the Germans did not pursue the British. Instead, Admiral Lutyens maintained the established course, without changing his general plan. Meanwhile, in London, the Admiralty reacted quickly. The news of the sinking of the Hood generated an unprecedented sense of urgency. Admiral Tovey, at the head of the Home Fleet, received orders to do everything necessary to find and destroy the Bismarck. The British fleet was mobilized immediately. Encrypted messages were sent to different squadrons and naval units in the Atlantic. Ships that were on routine patrols or escort duties were diverted to join the pursuit. In a few hours, a large part of the Royal Navy was mobilized with a single objective. On board the Bismarck, Lutyens had begun to receive intercepted radio messages. Although the British had suffered a great loss, their response was quick. The German admiral understood that his situation had become complicated. The damage received in combat, especially in the fuel tanks, seriously limited its range. He knew that he could not return directly to Germany via the original route, nor was it safe to head to Norway. Aware of the new circumstances, Lutyens informed Berlin of his decision to change the plan. Instead of continuing toward the central Atlantic, he decided to seek refuge in a French port under German control. The German Naval High Command, upon receiving this information, backed the decision. The ports on the Atlantic coast of France offered repairs, air protection from the Luftwaffe, and the possibility of resupply. But to get there, the Bismarck had to cross an area of the Atlantic where the Royal Navy had a strong presence. The journey would not be simple. As the pursuit progressed, the number of British ships involved increased. The Ark Royal, an aircraft carrier based in Gibraltar, sailed north with its torpedo bomber squadrons ready. The Renown, a battlecruiser, also joined the operation. The pressure on Lutyens grew with each hour. The Prinz Eugen, which had accompanied the Bismarck since the beginning of the operation, received new orders. It was decided to separate it so that it would continue the original mission of attacking Allied convoys alone. Despite the risk, the cruiser discreetly moved away from the Bismarck, maintaining a constant speed and avoiding radio contact so as not to betray its position. The separation was carried out without incident, and the Prinz Eugen managed to advance undetected by the British for a time. The Royal Navy, however, had focused all its attention on the Bismarck. Thanks to intelligence and sighting reports, they maintained an approximate idea of its location. But the Atlantic Ocean is immense, and tracking a single ship was not an easy task. Reconnaissance flights were carried out from Iceland, Newfoundland, and British bases in the United Kingdom. Catalina planes with great autonomy combed the sea looking for any sign of the German ship. Despite all the efforts, for several hours the Bismarck disappeared from radar and reports. During that period, Lutyens tried to use that advantage. He avoided transmitting signals, reduced speed, and sought a route that would take him away from the areas where a British presence was expected. However, the maneuver did not last long. A Catalina plane finally managed to sight it from the air, confirming its position and direction. With that information, the British fleet adjusted its movements. The King George V and the Rodney, two heavy battleships, received new coordinates to intercept the Bismarck. The cruisers and destroyers lined up to close the siege from different directions. The tension on board the Bismarck remained high. Although it had escaped direct combat, the threat was constant. Repairs were carried out at full speed, trying to contain the water leaks and maintain the maximum possible speed. The damage to the fuel system was worrisome. Although the ship kept its main armament intact, its maneuvering capacity was compromised. The crew's morale was firm, but everyone knew they were being hunted. As the British fleet approached, more offensive measures were prepared. The Swordfish torpedo bombers from the Ark Royal were prepared to launch a new attack. Despite being slow and outdated planes, they had an effective history in previous actions. An air operation was organized that required precision, since the sea was rough and the weather conditions made visibility difficult. Even so, the British pilots took off and headed for the target. In a first incursion, they confused the Sheffield with the Bismarck, which almost caused a disaster. Fortunately, the torpedoes did not explode due to technical failures. Having learned the lesson, the attack was reorganized. The next wave successfully located the Bismarck. Several torpedoes were launched. One of them hit near the stern, seriously affecting the ship's steering system. The damage forced the crew to attempt emergency maneuvers, but the direction was compromised. The Bismarck could only advance in wide circles, reducing its chances of evasion. From that moment on, the situation changed radically. The German ship was trapped. From the bridge of the King George V, Admiral Tovey received confirmation that the Bismarck no longer had freedom of movement. Plans for the final attack were intensified. The British ships organized into formation, ready for the definitive confrontation. The night was approaching, but the Royal Navy did not intend to wait. They knew that if they did not act soon, the Bismarck could receive air support or achieve temporary repairs. They could not take the risk. In the following minutes, the British destroyers advanced to harass the Bismarck during the night. They launched torpedo attacks, forcing the enemy to stay alert. The German crew responded with anti-aircraft and secondary artillery fire. The hours passed and fatigue accumulated on both sides. On board the Bismarck, the situation was becoming more and more precarious. The engines were running at their limit, the steering systems were not responding, and resources were beginning to run low. Dawn would bring the decisive moment. The siege was complete. The British fleet, reinforced and in position, was preparing for the final battle. The Bismarck, with no capacity to escape or receive help, would face its destiny. It was no longer an offensive mission or a secret operation. Now it was a fight for survival, with everything against it. And although the ship was still a floating fortress, each hour that passed left it more vulnerable. The pursuit, which had begun with the sinking of one enemy, was about to end with the destruction of another. The wounded monster that spun aimlessly towards death. The water was increasingly choppy as the Bismarck sailed into the early morning of May 25th. On board, the tension did not calm down. The crew was not sure whether they had managed to leave their pursuers behind or if the threat was still at their heels. From the bridge, Lindemann analyzed the radar reports and watched the horizon without rest. No one could confirm if the British were following them, but the uncertainty was as heavy as the steel of the hull that surrounded them. The ship was heading toward France, hoping to reach the Luftwaffe's air protection zone. However, what seemed like a break from the enemy pressure soon transformed into a false illusion. Intercepted radio signals from London revealed that the British had not given up and were continuing to organize a new stage of the hunt. In Portsmouth, the orders were clear. Do not allow the Bismarck to reach the continent. The British Admiralty had mobilized all available resources. Ships such as the King George V and the Rodney were already en route, sailing at maximum speed to cut off the German giant's path. In the air, the swordfish from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal were assigned to close the siege from the sky. Although slow and outdated, these torpedo biplanes were the best option for operating in the middle of the fog and rain. That same afternoon, a mistake almost cost the British dearly. The Ark Royal launched a first attack without confirming the target, and its planes confused the Sheffield with the Bismarck. Miraculously, the torpedoes did not explode due to a failure in the magnetic detonators. The pilots returned to the aircraft carrier confused, but with a lesson learned. The next waves would be more careful. When the Swordfish took off again, the weather had not improved. They flew low, through the Atlantic mist, with reduced visibility, and the wind hitting their canvas wings. Despite the bad weather, they located the Bismarck at dusk. This time, there was no room for error. The grey monster was sailing alone, without the Prinz Eugen or other escorts. The silhouette was unmistakable, advancing steadily, but with its anti-aircraft defence limited by the swell and the darkness. The German gunners opened fire with everything they had. The tracers crossed the sky like incandescent snakes, but the Swordfish descended without stopping. At low altitude, the Bismarck's heavy cannons could not follow them with precision. The planes approached one by one, launching their torpedoes from different angles, trying to hit the vulnerable sides of the ship. One of the impacts was devastating. A torpedo hit the Bismarck's stern right in the rudder area. The shock was felt throughout the structure, and in seconds the officers knew something was wrong. The rudder was jammed. The ship began to turn to starboard involuntarily. The engineers rushed to check the rear compartments, but it soon became clear that the damage was critical. The ship had lost its ability to maneuver. From that moment on, the Bismarck's course was no longer dependent on its commanders. The ship was turning in slow circles, unable to correct its direction. They tried to use the force of the engines to compensate, regulating the speed of the propellers on one side, but the effect was limited. They were trapped in their own course, vulnerable, exposed to enemy attacks with no possibility of real evasion. Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutyens remained calm. Despite the damage, they ordered the ship to continue advancing at the highest possible speed, hoping that the general direction would bring them closer to the French coast. On board, the mechanics worked against the clock, trying to access the rudder system, which was completely flooded. The incoming water made any real repair impossible. During the night, the crew lived through hours of tension. Distress messages were sent via coded signals, begging the Luftwaffe to send air cover or even for a submarine to come to their aid. But no one came. The radio picked up fragments of enemy communications. The British knew that the Bismarck was damaged, and they were not going to let it escape. At dawn on May 26th, the lookouts sighted the silhouette of the Sheffield again. The British were close, and every hour that passed was one more step toward the final combat. The weather was still cloudy, but that did not prevent the Swordfish from launching a new series of attacks to ensure that the Bismarck would not regain control of its rudder. The deck of the ship was filled with metallic debris, smoke, and shrapnel fragments. On the command bridge, Lutyens transmitted a message addressed to the German Naval High Command. "We will fight until the last projectile. The battleship's honor will be defended." The officers knew what it meant. There was no possible salvation, and every decision made was to gain time or delay the inevitable. The possibility of reaching the French coast was fading with every mile. As the day progressed, the attacks from the air became more sporadic. The weather limited the operations, but it did not stop the movement of the British ships. The Rodney and the King George V were now only a few hours away, positioning themselves for a direct attack. The Royal Navy did not want to take any risks. They had suffered too much with the sinking of the Hood, and this was their opportunity for revenge. The German officers organized the personnel for the final hours. Weapons were distributed among the sailors, battle stations were checked, and non-essential compartments were blocked. Some crew members wrote hurried letters or notes. They knew there would be no rescue. The atmosphere was somber but not chaotic. Many sailors acted with discipline, clinging to their duties as if that could change the fate that was approaching. During the night of May 26th to the 27th, the Bismarck sailed alone, turning slightly, with no real control of its course. The radars showed nearby signals. The final battle was hours from beginning. The following dawn would bring fire, steel, and the last stand of a giant that could no longer flee. The British were preparing to finish what they had started, and this time they would leave no margin for error. Crossfire until the steel beast was sunk. The first lights of day barely marked the horizon when the British fleet positioned itself to face the enemy battleship. The King George V and the Rodney slowly moved forward from the west, looking for the best distance to begin the attack. At that hour, the sky was grey and the waves moved slowly, but the tension was constant. The Bismarck still floated, although damaged, waiting for the inevitable. On board the Rodney, the sailors checked their positions one last time, while the main cannons slowly rose. When the order to open fire was given, the first broadsides crossed the sky. The explosions were heard for kilometers. On the German side, the gunners tried to remain calm. The Bismarck, although at a disadvantage, responded with its main turrets, trying to hit its opponents. However, the fixed course due to the previous damage made it an easy target. The first series of shots from the Rodney fell close but did not hit directly. The King George V joined with a rain of projectiles that began to impact the German battleship's hull. The Bismarck's upper structures were quickly hit. Pieces of metal flew through the air. Despite the impacts, the ship resisted. The German crew members maintained their posts, even when the enemy fire became more precise. On the Bismarck's command bridge, communications became difficult. The antennas had been destroyed and orders were given by shouting or with manual signals. The observation tower was hit and several officers died. Even so, the ship continued to fire, although at a slower pace. The secondary pieces no longer responded, and one of the main turrets was put out of action. The fire began to spread across the decks. From a distance, the Norfolk and the Dorsetshire watched the combat unfold. Their medium cannons also began to fire. The smaller projectiles added to the general destruction. In the midst of the chaos, a torpedo launched from the Rodney hit the side of the battleship. The explosion opened a breach below the waterline. Water began to enter the lower compartments rapidly. The pumps were not working correctly and damage control was minimal. The Bismarck's crew members knew that the end was near. Some took refuge in more protected areas, others jumped into the sea, although the waters were cold and rough. The ship began to list. The upper decks were enveloped in smoke and flames. The British continued to fire. The Rodney launched a new broadside that hit the centre of the hull directly, causing more internal explosions. The King George V maintained its constant rate of fire, hitting the stern and bow alternately. One of the Rodney's last projectiles destroyed what was left of the steering system. The German ship could no longer turn or correct its course. The remaining turrets fired without precision. At that point, some German officers proposed to scuttle the ship voluntarily to prevent its capture. The decision was made quickly. Demolition charges were ordered to be placed at key points of the ship. The technicians worked quickly while the structure was collapsing around them. The smoke was so dense that only shadows and flashes were seen from the other ships. At 9 in the morning, the battleship began to sink slowly by the stern. The water was already covering a good part of the back deck. The propellers emerged briefly before disappearing. As the hull tilted more, the internal explosions continued. The Dorsetshire approached and launched 2 more torpedoes to accelerate the sinking. One of them hit the centre of the ship, causing a large explosion. As the Bismarck submerged, some crew members managed to swim away from the ship, although many were dragged by the hull's suction. The flames continued to burn in the front, even when the stern was already underwater. At 10 in the morning, only wreckage remained floating, pieces of wood, clothing, nets, parts of machinery. The surface of the sea was covered with debris. The Dorsetshire and the Maori began rescue maneuvers. They lowered boats and tried to pick up the survivors who were floating in the middle of the ocean. However, the conditions were difficult. The sea was choppy, and some men sank before they could be reached. In total, fewer than 120 sailors were rescued. More than 2,000 did not survive. Some died from injuries, others from the explosion, many from hypothermia. The British suspended the operations when the presence of German submarines in the area was reported. On board the King George V, the atmosphere was solemn. Although they had managed to sink the enemy battleship, the number of lives lost was impactful. The captain informed the Admiralty of the result, including visual confirmation of the sinking. Photographs began to be taken from the ships to record the event. The images showed the column of smoke dissipating and the wreckage floating. In the Royal Navy reports, the confrontation was described as a decisive action. The cooperation between units, the precision of naval fire, and the impact of the torpedoes were highlighted. The lessons learned regarding coordination between planes, cruisers, and battleships were also mentioned. For the German Navy, the loss of the Bismarck was a difficult blow to assimilate. The ship had been a symbol of naval power, and its destruction marked a change in German strategy. The survivors were taken as prisoners. During the journey, some shared stories about the last moments on board. They spoke of the deafening noise, the intense heat, the chaos in the corridors, and the missing comrades. Several had lost friends and family members. Many were injured or in shock. Despite the correct treatment, they knew that the war would not end there. On land, the news of the sinking spread quickly. In London, the result was celebrated as an important victory. In Berlin, propaganda tried to minimize the event, but could not avoid the impact on the population. Partial reports were published, avoiding details about the actual number of dead. Some German officers began to question the effectiveness of sending large battleships without sufficient air or submarine cover. The British authorities ordered the preservation of the testimonies and a detailed record of what had happened. Analyses were initiated on the trajectory of the combat, the effectiveness of the armaments used, and the coordination between units. The role of the sailors who participated in the operation, many of whom would be decorated later, was also recognized. Meanwhile, at sea, the site of the sinking was marked on the maps as a strategic point. In the following days, some units returned to the area to check for remains and gather more information. On board the British ships, ceremonies were held to remember the fallen, both their own and the enemy's. On the deck of the Rodney, the sailors formed in silence while the chaplain read a few brief words. Thus ended the Bismarck's last battle, a brutal, decisive confrontation with consequences that would resonate for a long time on both sides. The end of the Bismarck, when steel was not enough to survive. That dawn in the Atlantic left more than steel wreckage, inert bodies, and dispersed smoke floating. What really remained in the water was a brutal, undiplomatic message. Naval supremacy was a matter of life or death. The sinking of the Bismarck, although militarily resolved, brought consequences that no one could ignore, neither in Berlin nor in London, nor among the men who survived. On the morning of May 27th, the British left the combat zone without worrying about rescuing everyone. Barely a few hundred managed to get out of the water. More than 2,000 were left below the surface. Many of the Bismarck's sailors did not die from enemy fire, but from drowning or exposure in the middle of the rough and cold sea. Only about 115 men were saved. Most never saw land again. Among the survivors were technicians, enlisted sailors, non-commissioned officers, and some officers, but no one from the command hierarchy. Admiral Lutyens disappeared along with the command bridge. Günther Lutyens, who had been presented in the German press as a symbol of decisiveness and professionalism, ended up as a tragic figure, buried with his ship. Nazi propaganda later turned him into a martyr. At the other extreme, Captain Lindemann also died. Some witnesses claimed that he tried to organize the evacuation, or even that he wanted to go to the bottom with the ship of his own free will. No one could fully confirm it. For the Kriegsmarine, the blow was devastating. Having lost its flagship on its first major operational mission was humiliating. The German authorities tried to control the narrative. In Berlin, Goebbels presented the event as a feat, highlighting the sinking of the Hood and the Bismarck's resistance until the end. But the reality was impossible to gloss over. The most powerful weapon of the German Navy had been lost without achieving the strategic objective of cutting off British supply lines. The German High Command immediately reconsidered its naval strategy. The surface units were relegated. The battleships Tirpitz, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau remained in port or carried out very limited operations. From that moment on, the effort was focused on submarine warfare. The U-boats, much more difficult to detect and more effective at harassing convoys, became the focus of the offensive in the Atlantic. The Bismarck disaster confirmed that large ships could not operate without air support or constant cover. The Royal Navy had demonstrated it convincingly. In the United Kingdom, the news was received as a relief. The loss of the Hood had left an open wound, and seeing the Bismarck sunk was perceived as justice. Churchill did not hesitate to politically capitalize on the victory. He had personally ordered that the Bismarck be sunk, and his insistence became part of his image of firm leadership. The hunt for the Bismarck became a symbol of national determination. The British press praised the coordination between naval intelligence, aviation, and the warships. It was highlighted that, despite the difficulties, the Navy had acted with speed and decisiveness. Some military analysts immediately began to reflect on the lessons. One of them was that the era of the great battleships was coming to an end. Despite its armor and firepower, a single torpedo had been enough to leave the Bismarck without the ability to maneuver. The rest was a slow execution. Aircraft carriers proved to be more useful in that scenario, allowing attacks from a great distance and greater flexibility. The war at sea was changing, and the sinking of the Bismarck made that clear. The testimonies of the survivors were collected by the British in later interrogations. Many of them spoke of the fear, the chaos during combat, and the moment the ship began to list. Some related that the sinking was not instantaneous, that the ship held out longer than expected, even with the hull broken. The Bismarck's internal structure, reinforced and compartmentalized, delayed the total sinking, allowing several to get out through the upper decks. Others were trapped with no possibility of escape. Most of those rescued were transferred to prisoner camps in Great Britain. They remained there until the end of the war. Some never returned to Germany. Others returned to a destroyed country without the regime that had sent them to sea. The memory of the Bismarck was etched in them as a mixture of technical pride and human tragedy. They had served on a powerful machine, but that machine did not protect them from the final outcome. Over time, the Bismarck became an object of study, of movies, of books, of technical debates. The interest did not diminish. Its sinking was a clear example of how technology by itself does not guarantee victory. It also showed how a tactical decision, such as not diverting to port after the initial combat, could have irreversible consequences. The obsession with continuing south, despite the damage received, sealed the ship's fate. Decades later, the Bismarck's hull was located at the bottom of the ocean. At more than 4,000 meters deep, the steel giant remained almost intact in several sections. Images of the wreck revealed the impact of the projectiles, the structural damage, and also confirmed that the ship was not destroyed by internal explosions. It was sunk by its own crew, by opening the scuttling valves. The self-destruction was a final gesture of control in the face of the inevitable. It was not a surrender, but a way to prevent the enemy from taking a trophy. That gesture was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as a sign of loyalty to the regime. Others saw it as a naval tradition that preferred voluntary sinking rather than capture. In any case, it represented the end of an era. The Bismarck was the last German battleship to be built with such ambition. Nothing similar was ever attempted again. The sinking also left lessons about Allied coordination. The operation combined intelligence data, aerial surveillance, the use of aircraft carriers, and attacks in waves. It was a clear example of how modern warfare required integration between different branches of the armed forces. For the British, it meant a boost in their naval confidence. For the Germans, a warning about the limits of technological superiority without logistical and air support. The Bismarck was remembered not only as a warship, but as a symbol of failed strategic decisions, of poorly employed technical pride, and of the brutality of the conflict in the Atlantic. Its story is not just that of a ship, but that of the men who crewed it, pursued it, and sank it. The 50,000-ton beast remained there, under the cold waters, silent, dismantled inside, but still imposing. Its metallic silhouette at the bottom of the sea continues to be an echo of the past. There is no tomb or monument that equals its presence. Only the ocean holds its entire history.